advent of very low carbohydrate diets, which would include carnivore diet and ketogenic diet, have really kind of exploded over the past decade. And prior to that, ketogenic diets were being used selectively in some patient populations, including in epilepsy, with quite a bit of success. But now that this diet, as well as the carnivore diet, have kind of entered the mainstream and touted to have so many benefits, which they may in the short to medium term, but we don't really have long-term data to suggest whether or not there could be harms as a result of not eating carbohydrates for extended periods of time. And one of the clinical observations that seems to be creeping up in literature and in clinical observation is that the pancreatic beta cells may have an issue adequately producing insulin after very long periods of carbohydrate restriction. And so when I was mentioning before, only looking at glucose dynamics kind of being incomplete, I think this is especially the case for any individuals who may have had very long-term low carbohydrate diets, to just ensure that the defect is actually with getting glucose into muscle via insulin signaling and not insulin production itself.
And just to highlight a little bit about what she said, there is a place for low carbohydrate diet. I absolutely believe that. We talk about that in my book, Forever Strong, that if you are metabolically healthy, then typically, and you are training and you are exercising, which we're going to talk about exercise, then you are utilizing your carbohydrates. With the statistics that I gave you at the beginning of this episode, where 40+% of individuals are suffering from obesity and potentially insulin resistance beginning before we are even seeing outward signs of obesity and the issues that ride alongside that, there may be a role for carbohydrate restriction. The goal, though, is to actually get people to be, number one, insulin sensitive, and number two, to have an appropriate body fat percentage and an appropriate healthy skeletal muscle mass percentage. When you are starting out on a nutrition plan, my recommendation, and I could easily say our recommendation, is we typically don't recommend going below 100 grams of carbohydrates a day. Again, this is a variation depending on the person. Exactly for that reason, you can get certain benefits. And by the way, I say this cautiously because I know there are a lot of providers listening. There are many providers that are in the low carb community. And again, we do believe that there is a place for a low carbohydrate diet. It is also important to think about things in context over time. And when we think about things in context over time, on one end, we see what the average American carbohydrate intake is 300 grams a day. We have seen the implications of that over time. We have increased levels of obesity, hypertension, high triglycerides, cardiovascular disease, impaired insulin. We know what happens over time. On the same hand, a long-term carbohydrate restricted diet, what happens when eventually somebody goes back to add in carbohydrates? If you don't use it, you lose it. That is not to say we are recommending high levels of carbohydrates over time. I think that can be damaging. In fact, that's the definition of diabetes. It's not that the carbohydrates are causing that, but it is elevated levels of blood glucose over a specific time period. The other aspect to that is humans are extremely flexible, nutritionally flexible. We want to make sure that you're able to get in a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. When you restrict carbohydrates too low, I'll ask you this, Alexis, when you restrict carbohydrates too low and you begin to add them in, things like fruits and vegetables, even though we consider them healthy, have you seen somewhat of an exaggerated response?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really trends with, it can vary a lot by the person, but it really can trend with how long somebody has been restricting these foods. We really need to have a better understanding and also monitoring of people once they're coming off of these diets. And it's actually really nice that the technology is kind of catching up with this, because continuous glucose monitoring has become more popular, and now people can kind of take that, get those insights in their own hands to understand how their body is responding and how that's making them actually feel. So, for example, if somebody's getting a big blood sugar spike, they may notice that induces quite a bit of brain fog for them. So, like, even if you don't have this CGM on, you may be able to identify feelings in your body that are telling you, like, I'm getting a blood sugar spike right now. I need to go for a walk, or I need to do some air squats, something like this to clear this excess sugar. And then, moreover, I need to figure out why these spikes are happening. What have I eaten, and like what have been my dietary patterns that could have contributed to this, or my movement patterns, things like this. I think it's super important to consider the long-term effects, like you mentioned before, because for a lot of things, there can be diminishing returns over time. And what started out as a great intervention that provided a lot of health benefits could ultimately end up causing harm if we're not really honest with ourselves about how we're doing on that diet. And I think with a lot of the lack of religion that's in our society now, people often turn to dogmas in other areas, including diet, to kind of fill that hole that's really kind of wired into the human psyche that really likes to grab onto something to believe in. And sadly, I think diet's not the place to do that, because we have to give ourselves the flexibility to be changing our nutritional habits with the changing demands on our lives and our goals. And I think we really need to maintain flexibility in that area to optimize health.